You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman. President Trump loves a bill signing ceremony. Supporters gathered around his desk, usually in the Oval Office, riffing with the media, even extolling the virtues of his favorite Sharpies, like when he signed H.R. 1, the Republican spending package, into law on the 4th of July last year.
We're going to make official the greatest victory yet when I signed the one big, beautiful bill.
But last week, in a surprise, Trump jettisoned an official ceremony for a bill that everyone expected he would sign.
Congress has passed the largest housing affordability bill in decades.
The bill in question is the 21st Century Road to Housing Act, which is kind of like a Washington, D.C. unicorn because it passed on a bipartisan basis by a lot. There were only 32 no votes in the House and just 5 no's in the Senate. The bill is a collection of measures focused on the supply side of the housing equation, things that might make it easier for prospective owners to buy a home and potential home builders to start constructing. Here's Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren talking about the vote.
It's bipartisan. We hammer this thing out. The need is huge.
One of the things the bill does is take specific aim at the power of private equity companies in the U.S. housing market. The president actually talked about a similar measure in his State of the Union address this year.
Last month, I signed executive order to ban large Wall Street investment firms from buying up into thousands single-family homes. And now I'm asking Congress to make that ban permanent because homes for people, really, that's what we want. We want homes for people, not for corporations. Corporations are doing just fine.
But the president canceled those plans to sign the 21st Century Road to Housing Act because he wants Congress to support a different piece of legislation, the Save America Act, which includes limits on mail-in ballots and new voter ID laws. As you might expect, that bill is controversial, and President Trump's critics have largely decried his move. Here's Congressman Adam Smith from Washington in a video last week.
We need to bring down the cost of housing. Petty partisan politics shouldn't get in the way of really one of the first bipartisan accomplishments that we've had in this Congress.
For now, it's up in the air if and when the housing bill's signing ceremony will come back. Here with more on what's actually in the bill and how it could affect us here in the other Washington is Heidi Groover, real estate reporter at the Seattle Times. Heidi, thanks for being back on Soundside. Welcome.
Great to be here.
So first off, what is in this bill when it comes to getting more housing built faster, Heidi?
So as you mentioned, the bill is really focused on boosting the supply of housing across the country. So a lot of it is pretty wonky regulatory changes, things like loosening some environmental review, offering grants for local governments when they allow more construction by changing their zoning or permitting rules, efforts to encourage more modular or manufactured home construction. And then there are also other elements like limits on private equity firms, grants for homeowners who need to make repairs on their homes, and many other things.
What did you find about how that could affect us here, especially in Western Washington?
Well, it's a little bit early to say. The goal is certainly to increase the supply of housing across the country, including here, in order to try to drive down prices. But that takes time to take effect. So generally, people in the building industry here, welcomed any reduction in regulation. But economists I spoke to said it will take years to see any effects of greater construction due to these changes. It's also worth noting that although there are some grant programs in the bill, it doesn't include a huge amount of new funding for affordable housing construction or, say, rental assistance. It's mostly focused on these regulatory issues, and those take time to play out. So generally, people I spoke to here are welcoming these changes, but not expecting to see our housing affordability crisis solved overnight.
You mentioned that there's not a lot focused just on the affordability issue itself. I mean, that's something we've talked about a lot recently with the King County regional homelessness count numbers, the homeless authorities count that came out last week showing an increase over the past 2 years in homelessness. So basically, we're talking here about kind of the overall housing market and how to boost construction rather than specifically targeting that issue of affordability. But the idea is that overall supply is supposed to, excuse the phrase, trickle down, right, Heidi?
Exactly. Yeah. There is certainly a connection between housing and homelessness, but changing regulatory barriers to build market rate homes faster or more affordably is not directly funding, say, shelters for people living outside. But the goal is that over time, if we make the entire market, if we bring more supply to the entire market, we make the entire market more affordable, then there are knock-on effects that benefit all of these challenges that we're facing. But this bill is primarily focused on increasing housing supply on the market rate side.
Let's talk about that private equity component. We heard Representative Smith earlier. He's been particularly supportive of this idea of curbing corporate power in the housing market. Can you give us a little bit more detail on that part of the bill? What would it do?
So this would prevent private equity firms from owning more than 350 single-family homes across the country. And this emerges from the last few years. I mean, generally since the housing crash in 2008, but especially since the pandemic, we've seen a big explosion in private equity firms, Wall Street firms buying up single family homes in certain markets across the country. And the concern is that, when they own them, even if they rent them out, they're removing those homes from the market for maybe a first-time home buyer or a family that's trying to buy a home. And so we should curb that activity, is the idea. This is primarily an issue in Sun Belt cities where housing is more affordable and the demand has been high. So the firms can come in, buy up a bunch of houses, and earn a decent profit on renting those out. Here in Seattle, even when rents are high, because homes are so expensive, that math doesn't always make sense for private equity firms. So when you talk to economists here, they say, this isn't a huge factor driving our affordability challenges, but it is something that people sort of have a gut reaction to not liking private equity buying a bunch of homes in their neighborhood or in their city. Just for some context, estimates really vary quite widely about how many homes in a market like Seattle these types of corporations even own. So there's one recent analysis from a data firm that found that firms with at least 350 single-family homes own less than 1% of all single-family houses in the Seattle metro area. A different report from U.S. Government Accountability Office found that investors owning at least 1,000 homes held 9% of single-family rentals in the Seattle area in 2022. So those analyses were done a bit differently. They're not exactly apples to apples, but you can see there's this range of how much of an effect this has in Seattle. And that's notable, but it's not really comparable to places in the Sun Belt like Phoenix or Atlanta, where this is an even more significant issue.
Yeah, I've seen an estimate in Atlanta that something like 30% of the single family home rental stock is owned by corporations. I believe they are the highest in the nation there in Atlanta. Heidi, I have seen some criticism that limiting institutional investors in housing could affect the supply of rentals in the long run. Have you seen any kind of pushback like that here in Washington state?
I haven't seen that exactly here, but there is ongoing debate about encouraging or discouraging landlords through various regulations. I think it's a separate conversation, and there is a tension between whether single-family homes are for sale or for rent, and we need supply of both types here in our area.
So obviously, the housing affordability crisis is a problem in many parts of the country. That led to this bipartisan agreement in Congress, and the bill is now on hold, waiting to see what Trump is going to be doing with it. But in Washington state, there have been a lot of movements in the legislature around housing at the local level, at least, and in the state and local level. Can you recap what lawmakers have been doing on this issue lately?
The bipartisan nature of this bill really reflects how many lawmakers are hearing from their constituents, from their voters, about their struggles with housing affordability. And that has been playing out here in Washington for years already. So the state has recently passed legislation requiring cities to allow more density. And that type of policy emerged from the sense that lawmakers on both sides of the aisle were going back to their districts and hearing constantly from voters that they were struggling to afford their rent or to buy a home. So that's one significant change that's happened recently, and cities are now in the process of implementing that. Seattle, meanwhile, is also considering more upzones to allow for more development of housing. Mayor Katie Wilson has said the city should build taller, denser, faster. We're currently in a long process of making that happen or seeing where that ends up. The city is also considering, lowering fees that developers pay to try to spur more apartment construction. And we have lots of ongoing conversations in the state legislature and locally about how to fund more affordable housing construction, rental assistance, and other things for people who are struggling to afford their housing.
So, Heidi, I know you're not a politics reporter, but I mean, at this point, the 21st Century Road to Housing has 3 paths forward. The president can veto it, he can sign it, or he can do nothing. If he does nothing and Congress stays in session, the bill could just become law. If he vetoes it, it could get way more complicated. It would go back to Congress. They would have to have a bigger majority in order to pass it. Any indication where this goes next, Heidi?
You sort of never know, but my impression from this Washington is that most people expect it will become law one way or another. And that is in large part because lawmakers are facing so much pressure to do something about affordability. And both parties have really promised to tackle this issue. And this is one thing that they can tout when they go out to voters this year. And so the sense seems to be that one way or another, we will see this become law.
That's Heidi Groover, real estate reporter at the Seattle Times, talking about the big housing bill that President Trump will not sign because he wants a voting ID and restrictions on mail-in voting bill to be signed first instead. Heidi, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. Don't forget you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime right here online at KUOW.org, or of course on your favorite podcast app.